According to Edmund Husserl's History of Philosophy, the history of skepticism is just as old as the history of Western philosophy. Skepticism for Husserl is a kind of persistent force that continues to animate philosophy and force it to push further. For all of the various foundational approaches to knowledge that philosophy has witnessed, there have been challenges to those coming from a radical form of skepticism, all dating back at least to the ancient Greeks and into the present day. And for Husserl, one of the most important developments of this was Descartes' use of skepticism, which greatly pre-delineated for Husserl the path of philosophy that he went on to endorse in his mature thinking. For Husserl, therefore, skepticism is not just a kind of philosophical challenge to be overcome, but nor is it something that a frivolous philosophical indulgence, as many thinkers today tend to think. We don't usually think that we need to justify the existence of the world in the way that Descartes asked us to do in order to get going with philosophy. And Husserl doesn't think that either, but he also thinks that skepticism of that kind, that very particular kind, external world skepticism, does tell us something important about what philosophy is. So what I want to do here is show how skepticism kind of traces through the evolution of Husserl's development of his methodology, which he calls the phenomenological reduction, and show how skepticism pertains to and evolves along with what I'm calling the Transcendental Insight, and I follow A.D. Smith on calling it that, a kind of maybe one of the most fundamental arguments in phenomenology, whose conclusion is the Transcendental Insight, and that is an insight that Husserl, from at least 1913 on, kept developing in a way that, in my view, really cultivates over time a more and more compelling argument. And I think at the end of his career, especially as we'll look at in the Cartesian Meditations, a late work for Husserl, he really gets that argument into a form that I find incredibly nuanced, incredibly compelling, and that I think is very poorly understood in the philosophical world at large. The first thing is that Husserl's account of skepticism and its role to play in philosophy, I'm basing that on his first philosophy lectures, and those are some kind of middle period works where he's really developing the transcendental motifs, and he's trying to work phenomenology. As anyone who knows anything about Husserl knows, that he's taking the same basic idea of phenomenology throughout his career and kind of reworking it, reshaping it, keeping the same fundamental core spirit of it, but kind of finding new ways to introduce it to different philosophical audiences and keep it abreast of present day developments. And so he's constantly kind of changing the way he wants to conceptualize it, this sort of systematic unity in the sciences and in philosophy itself. And okay, so first philosophy, systematic science, systematic philosophy, everyone's working on the same project, and it's kind of got this universal element to it where it can kind of bring everything into its fold. So Husserl self-consciously now, he doesn't always do this, and he would kind of later on roll off a little bit on this aspect, but here in the first philosophy lectures, Husserl is trying to come at philosophy from that angle as a systematic science. The second thing I think that's worth pointing out about the first philosophy lectures, which makes them quite a bit different than his published works, his typical written published works that were published during his lifetime. One thing distinctive about the first philosophy lectures is that he spends a lot of time, and almost half of the length of the work consists of a kind of history of philosophy going back to the ancient Greeks, of course, and moving into the present day. Husserl has a rather myopic view in some ways of the history of philosophy. There's a lot of weird kind of teleology in it, in the sense that he seems to find in philosophy, the history of philosophy, a kind of narrative march towards the end point of transcendental phenomenology. It makes it a little bit implausible in some ways, perhaps, but what we should remind ourselves is that Husserl isn't trying to put forward kind of what we would think of today as a kind of scholarly, careful, historically accurate way that events unfolded, but rather a kind of spiritual understanding of what philosophy is. And what I mean by spiritual is that it's meant to awaken our motivations to live a philosophical life and try to wonder what that is, as opposed to being a kind of purely abstract exercise. He thinks that philosophy needs to reawaken, individual philosophers need to be motivated by this sort of spirit of philosophy that has been passed down from the ancient Greeks onward, and that continues to nourish philosophers and draw them into this world that really has an origin in history, and that really, if there were not people working to preserve it, could go away. So what is he trying to motivate us to see? Well, there's a lot, and he goes through quite a lot. There's some elements that we think, well, maybe he ended up having to rush some of the stuff toward the end, but he spends a lot of time on the beginning, and he says philosophy can't be separated from the beginning, and he means that in a dual sense. It's sort of a double entendre in a way. Philosophy can't be separated from its historical beginning, going back to Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, but also that each philosopher individually must reawaken that beginning in him or herself. And the reason for that, philosophy can't be separated from its history under this perspective, because each philosopher has to anew make the decision to take on philosophy as a vocation. And so there is no like, if we take a class on physics, we'll just get the latest textbook, the latest results, and only if we kind of took a specialized niche interest in the history of the discipline would we then go and like read the original text of Newton's Principia or something like that. But in philosophy, it's not like that at all. If you want to know the state of the art in philosophy, you also have to go back to its history. You have to be able to look at what those ancient and medieval and early modern writers were writing, why they wrote it, and so on and so forth. So philosophy and Husserl's take on why we teach the history of philosophy as a part of the discipline, and not just as an additional external add-on for a different department to deal with, is because philosophy is about beginnings. And why? Well, take a look at skepticism. For Husserl, skepticism isn't a deviation from philosophy, something that kind of contingently arises and knocks philosophy off of its path for a little while, and then philosophy comes back and corrects itself. It's actually a very important part of the structure of philosophy itself is skepticism, and part of its beginnings. So he particularly starts with the sophists, and in thinkers like Protagoras and Gorgias. What he sees in those ancient skeptical thinkers is an impetus to see that the world is always given to us in subjective points of view and through a subjective structure. And Husserl even goes so far as to call this philosophy's first transcendental impulse. This is, again, the recognition that all objectivity, all objects of knowledge have to be understood in relation to the subjectivity which cognizes them or which perceives them. And Husserl thinks that this is kind of the fundamental, again, impulse of these ancient sophists, that they bring to our awareness for the first time in the history of philosophy what Husserl calls naivete. And naivete for Husserl is just a very specific term. What it always means is that a naive thought or a naive style of thinking or a naive thinker is a thought that does not place its object in relation to the subjectivity that cognizes the object. So another way to think about it is kind of degrees of self-consciousness in thought. And so a completely naive thinker is one who's just, if I'm studying the whiteboard marker, I'm a naive thinker if I'm just totally focused on the marker and my own thought process is completely transparent to me, if you like. I just see straight through. I don't even think at all about it. I'm just totally focused on the marker. And that is what Husserl thinks. That's what's called naivete, and it's the general way that we tend to approach things. We tend to focus on what we're thinking about, what we're working on, and not really about our own cognitive processes. Now, the first serious response to skepticism for Husserl is in the figure of Socrates, and more systematically in Plato. For Husserl, in the first philosophy lectures, Socrates and Plato do very much go hand in hand, although he does think that there are some real crucial differences for them between the two. But Socrates and Plato represent the orientation of philosophy, or the reorientation of philosophy around the demand for apodictic justification or absolute justification of insight. And in Plato, that's understood as insight into the essence of truth, being, and goodness. That shows you Husserl's positioning of Plato as a response to skepticism gives you a perhaps more epistemological reading of Plato than it might be standard. Husserl doesn't focus too much on Plato's metaphysics or the usual story about Plato's metaphysics, in any case, having to do with a realm of forms that are timeless and that determine the intelligibility of the realm of the senses, which is full of change, paradox, and unreliable as far as knowledge is concerned. Husserl doesn't emphasize that here. He actually thinks that what's distinctive about Plato, which you don't get in earlier manifestations of science and philosophy, like the pre-Socratics, and even what's only nascent in Socrates himself, is the radical self-responsibility or the radical self-legitimation of reason. That's the crucial thing for Husserl and Plato, is that reason self-legitimates, and it's the only thing that does that. So reason legitimates other claims of other truths about the world. Reason is what legitimates some process of thinking, says yes, this is legitimate, and it issues in valid truths, versus otherwise, reason is what legitimates other things and itself. Right? So reason has this self-standing character epistemologically, and that's very important. And that's something that Husserl thinks Plato and Socrates brought out. Socrates, in the sense that he turns towards the eidos and demands kind of conceptual knowledge. It's not enough for him that that there's social orthodoxies, or that that power hierarchies are arranged in such and such a way in society. Socrates thinks that Socrates demand the way Plato sets it up is that Socrates' demand for conceptual knowledge constitutes a kind of radical act, and radical countercultural act in his society. And what's going on there is the turn towards the eidos, the demand for conceptual knowledge, ultimately for justification of our beliefs. And the most crucial dimension of that justification is the giving account of oneself. So all of these ideas are very important for the beginning of philosophy for Husserl. And so notice the idea of a self-legitimating reason that gives itself its own sort of epistemic grounds, that for Husserl is in some sense the bread and butter of philosophy, and he barely allows that pre-Socratic philosophers even count. This really is the founding act of philosophy for Husserl, because what we have is something that is reacting to the rupture of naivete. Something that is reacting to the rupture of naivete, that's philosophical. Before you get that, you get the pre-Socratics, who are by and large, and we could argue, I actually think, I think Husserl maybe could have emphasized Parmenides more here. Setting that aside, in a general sense, we see for Husserl the pre-Socratic philosophers, those coming before Socrates and Plato, are very much characterized by what we could call a scientific naivete. It's that skepticism, key point, it's that skepticism that ruptures naivete and philosophy develops in turn.